I have another distinct pleasure this morning to introduce another rock star, somebody who we've been trying to get to come out here to be a keynote speaker for us for many years. Her name is Dr. Myrna Dawson, and she is the professor of sociology and director of the Center for the Study of Social and Legal Responses to Violence at the University of Guelph in Ontario. She is the director of the Canadian Femicide Observatory for Justice and Accountability, and she is the co-director of the Canadian Domestic Violence Homicide Prevention Initiative with vulnerable populations. For over 2 decades, Dr. Dawson's research has focused on patterns in and responses to violence, particularly with a focus on violence against women, gender-based violence, and femicide. She's a longtime member of the Ontario Domestic Violence Review Committee. She co-authored the foundational paper that the committee is based on. She is the co-author or editor of numerous publications and reports, including Domestic Violence Homicides and Death Reviews, an International Perspective in 2017, Violence Against Women in Canada in 2011, and Women Killing Intimate Femicide in Ontario, published in 1997. She has a long list of activities that she has been busy leading to help at the academy and governments and systems players and all of us understand and get underneath this epidemic of gender-based violence. She has presented her research in Australia, in Canada, in Italy, in the United Kingdom, United States, and she is a regular visitor of the many federal departments and departments of governments across the country. She, as I said, we've been trying to get her for a number of years, and I can't tell you how happy I am that she's finally here. Please help me welcome Dr. Myrna Dawson.
Thank you, Tracy. It wasn't that I didn't want to be here, just the timing never seemed to be the greatest. I'm actually from the other side of the country, and it always seemed to be that I was going either to visit my family because there was health reasons or there was other things happening. So I was thrilled to actually be able to come this year. So I want to begin by acknowledging that I have been invited to speak on the Musqueam territory, and I feel very honored to have been invited to speak here. I think what I want to start with, and actually, can I ask you when you're going to first flash a card at me? 15 minutes, okay. I often have lots to say, and I get on a tangent. Okay, so thank you, EVA BC, for inviting me to talk about the Canadian Femicide Observatory for Justice and Accountability. And before I start, I want to acknowledge the work of the Femicide Observatory is actually supported very well by a wealth of expertise, by a 40-member expert advisory panel on which Tracy sits as a member, and we're very thankful for Tracy's contributions as well as the contributions of the rest of the expert panel. I think one of the reasons why I like to speak in a room like this is because I'm talking about one type of information and expertise which comes from academia. I think it isn't as valuable in many ways as the expertise that sits in front of me in this room. So talking about this research and the research of the Canadian Femicide Observatory to you is important to me because I want to get your feedback on some of what we were doing. So I'm going to give you a sample of what we've been doing. And at any point throughout the day, I'd love to hear from you in terms of whether or not when we're talking that we're speaking in a language that people who are working the front lines can understand in terms of getting our voices out there. Now I realize, how do I? When a different screen looks at me, I'm lost. Pardon me?
It's the last 15 minutes.
Yes, okay. Oh, yeah. Okay. How do I get it to go full screen? Okay, good. Okay, so before I start, I want to talk about what I mean when I say the word femicide, and I'm going to give you a very sort of basic definition, and then hopefully we'll build on that as we go throughout the day. So femicide is essentially the killing of women and girls because they are women and girls. In other words, we're talking about women and girls being killed for a gender-related reason. And again, the meaning of this is going to become more clear as I focus on this excuse me, throughout the presentation. But at the basic minimum, what we're talking about is femicides that are very distinct from the killings of men, so very distinct from the homicides of men. Both men and women are killed primarily by other men, but the context in which they're killed varies significantly, and that's what we're going to talk about, and that's why we talk about gender-related motives or indicators, and that's what the terms I'll use as I go forward. A more recent iteration of the term femicide is feminicidio, which actually has been coined and adopted in some Latin American countries to reflect the ongoing high rates that there are. So at least half of the countries with the highest rates of femicide or feminicidio are located in Latin America. They've drawn attention to the impunity that's often follows the deaths of women and girls in Latin America, which means that state or state actors do not respond or their responses are quite inadequate. So the English translation of this is feminicide. So you'll see that in my slide, I actually have the term combined here to recognize not only that there's different terminology being used, but to actually acknowledge the groundbreaking work that actually has originated from Latin America and which informs a lot of the work that we do. I think the other thing that I like about the term feminicide or feminicidio is actually that it does focus on the impunity. And I think in the Canadian context, we've seen impunity of the killings of Indigenous women and girls for decades, and we've seen it most recently again in the final report of the inquiry that was released in June that we heard Chastity talk about. So impunity is not something that's a stranger to the Canadian context. So here I show the Global Knowledge Hub on gender-related killings of women and girls. So it's an international hub who has also merged the two terms in their logos. And we do this again to acknowledge the work that's being done in Latin America. But for those of you who might not know, the term femicide actually originated in 1976 by Diana Russell, who was a South African feminist pioneer, when she was testifying at the international tribunals for crimes against women. And she coined the term femicide at that time. But it's not new in the Canadian context either. I think familiar to most of you is the relevance of the term femicide, which will become which focuses on December 6, 1989, when a lone gunman entered École Polytechnique at the University of Montreal and shot 14 women and injured many others. Next week will be 30 years since that event occurred. When he entered, he shouted, "You're all a bunch of feminists, and I hate feminists," before firing at the women. I don't think there's a more clear act of gender-based violence than that mass femicide, and that's what I refer to it as is a mass femicide. At that time, the word femicide actually entered the public domain quite vigorously, then to disappear again, broadly speaking, in public discussions. There was a lot of groups that were still using it, but it disappeared for a number of years. And then there's two parallel initiatives that have brought it back out in the public domain. So the first has to do with work by the Women We Honor Action Committee. So in 1989, earlier in 1989, before the Montreal massacre occurred, 8 women in Ontario who actually were working in the violence against women sector got together because they had each experienced the death of a woman that they had been trying to help. And they originally actually got together to provide support to each other, to talk about how they could deal with the fact that sometimes they just seemed powerless to prevent the deaths of women. So from that discussion, they decided that they wanted to understand the deaths of women, and in particular for their focus, they wanted to focus on the deaths of women killed by current or former male partners. And so they got together and they started a study. And what they wanted to do was to document the incidents of killing by intimate partners, to describe the characteristics of the people involved and the circumstances that surrounded the events. And they also presented a small number of stories from women who had been killed by talking to the family and friends, and so constructing the events around their deaths. So the study occurred in 2 stages, and so the data that actually come out of the 2 reports that are shown here covered 1974 to 1994, and they actually documented the killings of all women during that period. So there was 1,206 women killed, 63% of which were killed by current or former intimate partners. And here they coined the term intimate femicide. So I was a graduate student in the mid-1990s, and I was looking for some meaningful work to volunteer on. And fortuitous for me, because it ended up being a core focus of my research for the next 20 years, was that I volunteered with the Women We Honor Action Committee, which also reinforced to me very early in my career the importance of cooperating, collaborating, listening to the community advocates that are working on the ground. What I learned during that project has come with me for many years to come. So then with this project, as so often happens, the Women We Honor Action Committee sort of disbanded, and then I continued to take the research forward for the next 20 years. And then 2 years ago, we rolled the project out nationally, and we're in the process of doing that, and it's called the Geography of Justice Project. And so we're focusing on homicides more broadly in the Canadian Geography of Justice Project, but specifically on femicide through the Canadian Femicide Observatory. So at the same time as we were rolling out the Geography of Justice Project, the United Nations Special Rapporteur for Violence Against Women, Its Causes and Consequences began to call on all countries to establish what she calls femicide watches or femicide observatories, which is where we drew the word from. And this publication came out in 2017, and it's part of their series on femicides that they've been publishing since 2013 from the Academic Council of United Nations System. And she's been repeatedly calling for countries to establish these observatories or watches since then, and most recently has done so when she visited Canada in 2018 and issued a country report in 2019. So while she's issuing this call, I'm rolling out the project nationally. I've always been interested in the context of intimacy and how it plays into the deaths of women. A lot of my work had focused on the criminal justice response, and so how do we symbolically respond to these deaths? And in a sense, we have an intimacy discount in our criminal justice system. We don't respond to women who are killed in the context of intimacy like we do to women killed outside the context of intimacy. That varies, of course, by identity. I was acutely aware of the impunity around the killings of Indigenous women and girls because we identified that in the Intimate Femicide Report, the 2 women killing reports in the mid-1990s. It's continuously being identified by the work, the groundbreaking work and the grassroots efforts of the inquiry, again released in June. So we know that this is an issue. And I've always been very concerned about increasing awareness about femicide, and I think it's really important to me to use language that actually draws attention to what we mean when we talk about femicide. So I decided it was time to launch the Femicide Observatory. So on December 6, 2017, so 2 years ago, using funding from the federal government through the Canada Research Chair Program, we launched the Observatory, which is a bilingual initiative that means to bring a visible and national focus. And here I want to recognize some of the really hard work that some groups have been doing across the country in the provinces and territories, silent witness programs, OAIF in Ontario. They've been documenting women's deaths. But what was very profound for the expert panel when we started to do this at a national level was sometimes if you're in one part of the country, you might hear about it, but it doesn't resonate like a death that's in your own part of the world, or own part of the country. And so even within the expert panel, when we started to track these deaths, it was profoundly disturbing that we didn't recognize the extent that this was occurring. Now here I want to do a bit of a qualification. I'm going to talk about femicide as a gender-related killing. I'm not saying that femicide occurs more often than homicides of men. It's not about a competition. We know that men are killed much more frequently than women are, by other men primarily. But what we want to do is focus on the killing of women, or femicide, because it is so distinct from the killing of men, such that some of the data that we collect actually doesn't capture the information that we need to inform prevention in a meaningful way. So the observatory has a number of mandates. The first is to track, monitor, and remember the killings of women and girls. And by remember, we do the #RememberMe campaign during the 16 days of activism, which is ongoing now, in which we tweet out the images and the names, when we have them, of women and girls who have been killed so that people will remember them. We're working on identifying variations across the country in terms of legislation, policies, and programs, and so there's some work that we're doing at my center that's looking at government responsiveness, and we're specifically looking to compare provinces and territories, and we know provinces and territories don't like to be compared, but I think it's important that we do compare because there's real inequities across the country in terms of what is available to respond to violence against women and gender-based violence. The other thing we're doing is trying to document the responses, both state, with represented by the court system, and social, represented by the media. So looking at how these crimes are portrayed both within the media and within the court to identify damaging stereotypes that in particular focus on groups of women and girls, but more broadly in terms of how we do discount certain deaths of women and girls because of the characteristics that they have or the relationship that they shared with their killer. So in in January 2019, we released our first report. Again, it's available in both French and English. Anybody who wants it, it's downloadable from our website, and I'm happy to actually share it via email if you want to touch base. In early July, and just this past summer, we released our mid-2019 report, and I'm not leaving these up here long enough for you to actually look. I just want to make you aware that they're available. These are 2 infographics that we released, and we have fact sheets available that document the number of women and girls killed up until the end of June. And then next week, on December 6th, we'll release our second report for the deaths up until November 30th this year, and we'll do an update in January for the complete year. So that's a bit about the observatory. Since we're focusing actually on supporting survivors across the years, I want to give you a sneak preview of what femicide looks like, or women and girls killed in Canada across the age groups. So this is the data from 428 victims that have been killed from 2016 to the current day. So this report that's being released next year will have aggregate data that goes back over the almost 4 years. So 428 women killed, of which we had 98% information on their ages. So this graph shows the 419 victims. So the victims ranged in age, as most of you probably know, from newborns to the age of 98 years, with an average age of 42 years. The blue bar represents the proportion of victims in that age category. I hope you can see the age categories on the bottom. And then on the orange bar actually shows their representation in the population. In other words, how many women in that age group were actually at potential risk of being killed is the orange bar, and the blue bar is how many actually were. So when we see, in comparison to their distribution in the general population, that victims aged 25 to 34 represented about 1 in 4 victims, women and girls killed in Canada, which is a significant overrepresentation. It's also consistent with official figures, and it's consistent with a lot of the figures in westernized countries or developed countries across the world. What I want to point out here that's interesting, and we'll talk a bit next week, is the last set of bars on the right. So this is the age of women 65 and older, designated as seniors in Canada, who are slightly underrepresented at 16% of the victims compared to 18% of the population. We noticed this in our inaugural report that we released earlier this year, so we identified it as an emerging trend because this is something that's been recognized across the world. It's that the aging population is meaning that we're having a larger age group that's at risk of different types of violence, and aging women or elderly women or older women, whichever category we use to define them, is a group that there is hardly any research out there on them, and the World Health Organization has recognized this as well, and so there's been a lot of moves to do something about it. This is the graph that will be in our report coming out next week. So you can see the last 2 bars. In 1 year, they've become the most significant group of women and girls killed in 2019. They're now at 21% of the victims compared to 18 or 19%. My eyesight is not very good among the general population. So they've gone from being underrepresented last year to overrepresented this year. Not significantly so, but it's an emerging trend that we have to pay attention to. The other thing I want to mention here is there's quite a variation in how people define elderly. I like the upper 65 because it means I'm much further away from it. But a lot of people actually go as low as 55 as the threshold. The World Health Organization uses 60. So there's quite a bit of variation. But even if we look at the 55 and older, which they're underrepresented compared to the general population, but their proportion of victims went from 27% in 2018 to 32% in 2019. So we can see a bit of a difference, and it's something that we really have to watch out for because the population is aging. And these victims often are subject to gender-related motives, just like any other victim. So I want to turn to that now. What is a gender-related motive or indicator? So what I show here is one of the most comprehensive efforts to date to document gender-related motives. And that, again, comes from Latin America, and it's a model protocol for the investigation of gender-related killings. So the premise that they begin with is that all femicides are homicide, but not all homicides of women are femicide. And that's the premise we start with. Even though we count all women, they will not all end up being femicide because not all will end up having gender-related motives. Now, their protocol specifically targets criminal justice investigations, so their protocol was put together to help police and prosecution investigate and then prosecute the crimes. But it's a great starting point for researchers, myself and others throughout the world, who are trying to actually educate ourselves and the broader public about what we mean when we say gender-related motives. So we draw on their work considerably. So this is a very long quote that comes from the protocol, but I think it's informative in terms of thinking about a first sort of look into what we mean when we talk about gender-related motives. So the factors that differentiate the crime of femicide from homicide of a man, and even from the common homicide of a woman, reveal that the aim of killing is to entrench and perpetuate the patterns that have been culturally assigned regarding what it means to be a woman, which is subordination, weakness, sentimentality, delicateness, femininity, etc. This means that the femicidal agent and his actions draw on cultural patterns rooted in misogynist ideas. And the cultural patterns are important here because when we're trying to combat femicide, we can't just focus on individuals, we have to focus on communities and societies. So misogynist ideas of male superiority, discrimination against women, and disrespect towards her and her life. These cultural elements and systems of belief make the perpetrator believe that he has sufficient determinative power over the lives and bodies of women to punish them, and ultimately to preserve social orders of inferiority and oppression. These same cultural elements allow the perpetrator to feel reinforced in his manhood through this conduct. So this is a direct quote from the protocol, and the protocol actually had a number of people involved from the United Nations and various working groups in terms of trying to get a grasp of what we mean by gender-related motives, because we throw around the terms gender-based violence or gender-related motives, but we don't actually drill down and say, okay, what is it? Because I've had people ask me before I started this work, well, what do you mean? And I've been stumped, because when you try to explain that more publicly, it's really difficult to do. But if we want this to start to resonate publicly, we have to take some time to figure out how to talk about it. So breaking this down further then, it's a characteristic that signifies whether and how a killing was rooted in a perpetrator's misogynist attitudes or community and societal level acceptance of or support for those attitudes. And I'm going to come to some examples of this to sort of try to play this out. And I don't think a lot of these examples are going to be that unfamiliar to most of you in the room. So the motives center on women as possessions or women as objects. And so if we think about intimate partner femicide, that's usually the type of femicide that's more consistently aligned with perceiving women as possessions. And then sexual violence is often more aligned with the concept of women as objects. But again, these aren't mutually exclusive because intimate partner femicide can also be sexual femicide, so there can be some overlap. So as I go through I got about a half dozen or so, depending on how much I get through, of what I call GRMIs for short form, and my talk would be finished by the time I finish getting that out every time. So GRMI is the gender-related motive or indicator. So as I go through them, the question that you have to keep in mind in terms of understanding why this is gender-related is how often are these characteristics or factors present in the killing of a man or in the homicide of a man, regardless of whether or not that perpetrator was a male or a female. And again, I think a lot of you are going to be familiar with some of these gender-related motives or indicators because they actually align with risk factors for women being killed. But it's the language in which we talk about these risk factors that we don't seem to, in the outside world, I'm not talking about in here because I think in here we recognize this, but in terms of talking about this publicly, this is what we have to start explaining to people in terms of that's why we need to call it femicide, because it's different than homicide. So, committed previous physical, psychological, and sexual violence. Again, this is going to be familiar to all of you. So this is when there's repeated expressions, when there's a history of violence, or there's an incident of violence. And this doesn't have to be just in the context of domestic violence or intimate partner violence. The perpetrator could have a prior history of violence against a woman or girl that is outside the context of intimate relationships. So for example, many femicide cases during the last 4 years that we've been drawing our examples from involved accused who were before the courts, not surprising, for perpetrating violence against their female partners, female victims, or offenders who had already been convicted of prior offenses against them, previous female partners, or women generally. So there was a case in Western Canada in which a young mother and her child were found in a wooded area, and there was some speculation. There was an intimate relationship between her and the accused. A previous partner in divorce papers, because his previous partner was divorced, had documented that he had emotionally destroyed her during the course of their relationship, his first marriage. So there's a history of violence, not just against the current partner, but against previous partners. And, animal cruelty, which we know is also correlated with violence, was also documented in that. So among others, some of these charges included distributing intimate images, animal cruelty, uttering threats, mischief, common assault, sexual assault causing bodily harm, as well as breaches of previous restraining orders, no contact orders, and peace bonds. This is a gender-related motive. This suggests how this particular accused perceives women and girls, both inside and outside the context of intimacy. It bears noting, the second one, separate from prior violence, and that's coercive controlling behaviors. And there's been a lot of discussion internationally about this concept, which is almost exclusively a male phenomena and a male behavior in terms of physical or sexual violence or psychological emotional abuse that's used to the point that, physical violence may not always be there, but at some point it doesn't have to be there because a look will do just fine. And so these are tactics used to control women and girls. And the United Kingdom is one of the only jurisdictions, I think, that has currently brought it in as an actual offense. And there's some controversies around this, so I think we really need to be careful because this is something that's difficult to document, but it's something that we have to be more aware of. So for example, in some of the cases that we looked at in the last few years, one accused had called his female victim as much as 33 times a day. I've had students tell me that means that he loves them. It sounds funny, but it's a bit disturbing. But this is how we need to sort of start talking about this differently. Another offender wouldn't allow his female partner to have male friends or to connect with family on social media. Still another accused reportedly would not let his female victim speak to her parents who live some distance away, would not give her access to her travel documents so she could visit her parents, and would not let her use a cell phone. Another perpetrator called repeatedly when the victim was out with others, demanding to know her activities and whereabouts. He controlled her social media presence, told her when to unfriend people, and wouldn't allow her to post photos until he approved of them. Those are coercive controlling behaviors. That's a gender-related motive or indicator. Separation, I think this one is fairly self-explanatory. It involves a femicide that has occurred after a woman has either said she's going to leave, is in the process of leaving, or has left. So during the 4 years, some of the cases, and again, I'm not going into many details of the cases. I don't think people need to hear them. You can read about some of them in our report next week if you want, but sometimes I find that it's better to sort of talk about some of the basic details rather than to sometimes traumatize ourselves by talking about the more in-depth details. And I'll leave you to do that on your own if you like. So one victim told her male partner that she and her children would be leaving. That night he stabbed her to death in front of her children. A woman who was frequently seen with bruises was telling her family that she wanted to leave, and so they believed that she was in the process of doing so but didn't get the chance. Another victim had already left, but the perpetrator couldn't accept the fact that she had, and this is a common scenario. And then in one case, family members indicated that the perpetrator became increasingly aggressive to his ex-girlfriend after she left him, harassing, intimidating before shooting her and then injuring her sister. So again, the thing we need to keep asking ourselves is how common are these in the context of male homicides? And it's not to say that there's not horrific characteristics in male homicides. There are. But it's about understanding how the killing of women is different horrifically, in horrific ways, than the killing of men. And so the way we think about, and for me as a researcher, the way we collect data is extraordinarily important, because if we think about StatsCan data, we don't get this type of data in the homicide survey, which would help inform prevention. So the fourth, the victim declined to establish a relationship. So essentially this is a victim who has spurned the advances of an individual. Under this, we also capture situations in which the perpetrator thought they were actually in a relationship and didn't tell the victim, or felt that the victim had given indications that they were in a relationship and they really weren't. And so there was one case during the period that we examined where they lived on the same floor, they were in an apartment building, and the perpetrator sexually assaulted, went into her house and sexually assaulted her and killed her, and when the police arrived, he indicated that it was his girlfriend, and everyone on the floor and in the building knew that there was no relationship between them. So again, it's a gender-related motive. A woman doesn't have the opportunity or the ability to make a life choice that she doesn't want to be in a relationship with an individual accused. Number 5 is oppression, domination over women or girls' life decisions or sexuality. And again, this stems from the patriarchal organization of families and broader communities and broader societies, depending on what world region you live in. Here, the male is viewed as the decision maker, particularly over the lives of women and girls. Femicide occurs when a woman tries to exert control over her life or makes a decision that contradicts what the male in her life would wish to happen. So for example, one accused reportedly wanted to control the location of where his mother lived. So the woman was elderly, her children lived out of country, the daughters were trying to get her to move to the country that they were living in. The son had power of attorney, and rather than let his mother leave, he killed her and killed himself. In another situation of ongoing oppression, a woman was victimized by not adhering to her male partner's notion of being a proper wife, and that was used. Another woman was killed during an argument or the fact that she wanted to begin working again, which reportedly left the offender feeling insulted and disrespected. So these sometimes are a little bit more difficult to get at, and I'm going to come back to in the end, is that unless we actually carefully investigate these crimes, we never get a sense of this happening. And in particular, if there's been a suicide in the context of domestic violence, if there's a suicide afterwards, those cases aren't often investigated as thoroughly as if they were going to criminal trial. Prior threats to either kill a woman or girl or threaten family members is also considered a gender-related motive and indicator. I think this is a fairly self-explanatory one. How am I doing for time? Good? Sexual violence. So I want to come back to this one because we did talk about prior sexual violence in the context of prior violence against an intimate partner primarily, although it could have been prior violence against a previous partner or woman. But I want to talk about it here in terms of the sexual elements of the killing, and then some of the things that we don't often think about as sexual violence, such as forced abortion, forced pregnancy, sexual slavery, and don't think that it doesn't exist in our country, and I'm sure that you know that it does, forced prostitution, and forced nudity. So in the group context, which are also present in our own country, and I say that because I've had discussions with international folks when we've talked about this, and we talk about some of the characteristics that I'm going over here, and they'll say things like, well, that probably doesn't occur in Canada, but it occurs in this location because there's armed conflict, etc. But I think it depends on how you think about this type of group context. And I think we've heard a lot about gang rapes in the media recently, so that's a group context. So it involves sexual violence and torture that's used to affirm or reaffirm belonging to a group or to seek acceptance of men in a group. It may also be violence that's directed against women in their public life, such as voyeurism or exhibitionism. And then with respect to the actual killings themselves, there's public exposure, the way the woman's body is left, sometimes fully nude or partially nude. There's placing or insertion of objects on the woman's body. There's sometimes degradation and humiliation types of acts that often show this hatred or contempt, and we're going to come back to that in a moment. So for example, one offender smothered and stabbed his victim until she stopped making noises, and then he sexually assaulted her. Another offender was a neighbor who lived next door to the woman. He continuously entered her home uninvited, demanded sexual favors, exposed himself to her, and then sexually assaulted her while her grandchildren were in the home. When she was finally killed, the case was actually before the court. Some of these offenses were before the court, and she had actually told the police that she was living in fear of her life, which understandably she was. In another case, the offender broke into the victim's home, laid in wait for her. This is the one I was talking about earlier. He brought his own pornography, turned on her TV, and when she came home, he sexually assaulted her and then strangled her to death. Again, some of these matters were before the court, but the court system moves at its own pace, and the situations didn't get resolved, and we're not actually quite sure that they would have been able to resolve them in the way that would have made a difference. Excessive violence and mutilation. So a term that we often hear, and when I was involved in the woman killing project a couple of decades ago, I often heard coroners use the term overkill. And that's essentially what we're talking about here. So it's either the multiple use of, using one weapon multiple times, or using a bunch of different methods in a way that's just far beyond what it actually was required to kill a person. And so these are common in intimate partner femicides, but not exclusively. We see some, not just in Canada, but in Canada and more broadly. There's brutal and excessive violence involved in the killing of Indigenous women and girls that's been documented in our research and in other research. The death may be caused by mutilation or as a result of genital mutilation. So if a person dies during genital mutilation, that would be considered a femicide because genital mutilation is considered a gender-related motive. It can also be dismemberment and or decapitation, regardless of whether it was done to conceal the body or to avoid detection. And here when we were talking to some of the people around this particular one, they were saying, well, how is that gender related? I mean, they're just trying to make sure that the crime isn't discovered. Well, if you think that it's okay to chop somebody up and distribute them around in many locations, that's a disregard and a hatred for that particular person. And how often do we actually hear that happening to male victims of homicide? I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I've been studying homicide for a number of years, both women victims and male victims, and I very seldom hear about that, except for in the context most recently, perhaps, with respect to the Bruce McArthur case, the serial perpetrator in Toronto that targeted the gay community. So again, it's somewhat different, except for some anomalous cases. So the last one I want to talk about is misogyny, because that's the word that we talked about a bit when December 6, 1989 happened. I was too young to remember, but I've read about discussions around misogyny coming out about that, because we heard about it again in the Toronto van attack. We heard the word misogyny, and then we started to hear the word femicide. And this involves perpetrators who demonstrate a strong prejudice against women, which could be directly expressed through statements of hatred, or indirectly through attitudes and beliefs. So women are only available to be domestic servants, whether in a relationship or outside, and or to be used sexually. So these types of gender-related motives that we call misogynist attitudes are much more difficult to get at, and I'm going to come to an example in a second, but I think they're often some of the most detrimental because they are sort of a part of the actual way that this individual leads their life in terms of how they interact with women, both inside their relationships and outside their relationships. So, for example, one victim whose body was mutilated and disposed of in several random locations was killed by an offender who had a long criminal record involving multiple previous incidents of stalking, harassment, and violence against other women, and there was also prior violence across a number of other cases in which men inside their intimate relationships had been violent to women they had never been intimate with. So we're not talking about specialists here, we're talking about, in many cases, generalists. Another victim was reportedly not allowed to use her cell phone. I talked about her earlier, because apparently only the husband is allowed to use the cell phone, and I quote. And then I talked about the woman who was not the proper wife. These are misogynist attitudes. We may think of them as, just the way people are, but they're misogynist attitudes that create a culture in which women are seen in a particular way. Another offender who killed a woman and her daughter because he believed the woman had advised his female partner to separate from him, and he was so angered by the fact that she had entered into their relationship, he killed her. Another case, the previous partner of a femicide perpetrator described him as cruel and emotionally disturbing, and I mentioned her before. And then there was a perpetrator who throughout their marriage abused her verbally, rejected the food that she made, and made her ask for permission for everything, even when they were out in public in front of people. So one of the things that I think when we think about, and again, the Latin American Protocol talks about the investigation of these crimes, and there's a big movement around, if this is the case, then why aren't we referring to these crimes as hate crimes? Because there's indicators of hatred that are filtering through many of the characteristics of these cases, but you cannot find them unless you do a thorough investigation. So for example, I imagine many of you heard about the Danforth shootings that were sometimes, I think it was last year, in which a young woman and a young girl were shot in the Danforth area in Toronto by what was portrayed to be a random man who had mental health and substance abuse issues wandering the streets and just randomly picking people to shoot. And the Toronto Police Service actually released a report, I think in June of this year, in which the randomness seems to actually sort of weaken, because when they searched his apartment, there's no doubt that maybe he did have substance abuse issues or mental health issues, but they found a lot of material in his apartment that showed that he had killing and murderous fantasies. He had information on the incel rebellion, which I think many of you know about, which is, involuntarily celibate because men can't find a mate and they're angry about it. He had a lot of material on that. And just that day, his family had sat down and said that they had talked to him and said that he needed to find a wife. And this really upset him. And that evening, he went to the Danforth. So if we don't look into these cases in a way that actually gets that information out more publicly, we think that they are just random. And in fact, many times they're not. So in moving forward, we've heard a lot of stuff about data, and I think that's a real issue when it comes to the work that we do and the work that you do. It's about identifying and accessing appropriate data sources. And so the Canadian Femicide Observatory for the past 2 years has actually been focused on media reports as our first step, and there's research in the United States that has shown that the media reports are actually as reliable for some facts, such as gender and age and relationship, as official statistics. Because official statistics, which I have access through other work that I do, there's a lot of restrictions around what you can do with that data, et cetera. So some of my work uses StatsCan data, but this work focuses specifically on media reports. In the last 2 years, all of a sudden, it appears that the media is getting less and less information. And I try not to become paranoid, because I think that people have been doing this work for some time in different regions of the country, but all of a sudden there's no names being released, which are fine. But there's no gender or sex being released, there's no relationship being released, they're not actually giving any information to allow for people to track what's going on in a particular community. And one of the reasons why I think we need to be concerned about this is our report last year showed that certain victims, Indigenous victims in Manitoba and Nunavut, were most likely not to be named, and there's very few information on some of those killings. And so why is there some cases that are described quite explicitly in the media, and then other cases don't get any attention? And I think that's an issue that we really need to pay attention to. I think we also need to move beyond the official constructions of the crime. And here, at some point, I think it would be nice to see that there would be some initiatives for people to collaborate, and we've heard Jennifer talk about collaboration. There needs to be a collaboration. Right now, we're a group of researchers that are accessing data through media reports, and we're working through other ways to do it, and we've talked to people in other parts of the world who submit freedom of information requests to police jurisdictions for every case, which we'll pursue at some point. But that's a huge resource to use that sometimes is, not possible, depending on the funding. Again, talking about how we operationalize gender-related motives so that there's consistent tracking of these cases. If we want to understand femicide or understand gender-related killings, then we need to understand and be able to communicate to the public what we mean by that, and that's part of what we're doing. Valuing all women's and girls' lives. And I recently had someone contact me and wanted me, and I hope I can, to talk about who we memorialize and who we don't. And I think that's a really good question, especially as we approach December 6th. Who do we memorialize and who do we never sort of pay attention to? And I think that's a question that we have to start looking at ourselves. And one of the reasons why we do the #RememberMe campaign is that every woman or girl then is remembered, but that's just one way. So how can we do that in a better way? And then finally, the counting of femicide. It's a very political phenomena. And so how do we keep the politics there, I guess, because in a way that the personal is political, and we're talking about very personal stuff. But we can't get so bogged down in the politics that we forget that the reason we're actually trying to do this is to inform prevention of women and girls being killed, which is very distinct. And there's a book come out recently by a woman called Perez, and this is a little bit off topic, but she talked about, the book is called Invisible Women. How many people have heard about it? Okay, so she actually argues that from smartphone design to medical trials, that data has actually been generated by and for men, including how seatbelts are in your vehicles, etc. And recently I started thinking to myself about the Homicide Survey, which is our main data source for looking at lethal violence in Canada, and how it has been designed largely based on what is the dominant form of homicide, which is male-on-male homicide. So the Homicide Survey doesn't have things about the type of relationship. It has a history of family violence, which is very ambiguous, and it doesn't say the direction of violence or anything. It doesn't apply to people who are dating. So there's huge gaps in our national data source, even though as a country we're fairly well off in terms of the data that we have compared to other countries, because StatsCan does have some reliable data, although there's still issues, which I won't go into, it's a whole other topic. So what I want to end with is this: why it's important to do this work, and then to sort of say why it's been successful in Latin America, why there's been so much success in Latin America. Is people have just gotten tired of waiting for the government to do something, and they've organized from the ground up. And I think that's really what we have to start to do in Canada. The Canadian Femicide Observatory partners with organizations in different regions of the country. We try to share data. Recently, a jurisdiction who shall remain nameless, this organization used to get names of women who were killed in their province, and they would use those names on December 6th. And this government department recently told them that they were no longer going to release those names to them because of the abundant concern around privacy and confidentiality. But they were just releasing names which are in the media, ages, and locations. And so the group that is no longer getting them, we've given them the data we have, which is publicly accessible on the website. But this means that if there's greater concerns with privacy and confidentiality, then we need to mobilize from the ground up. And in part, that's what we're trying to do with the Canadian Femicide Observatory. Because I think if we're going to produce accurate statistics, it requires more than looking at the Homicide Survey anyway, which is really administrative survey data that's submitted by the police. And as you know, sitting in this room, I know there's police here, and they play a core response role to violence against women and girls, but there's a whole bunch of other sectors here that hold much more, in many cases, information about these cases that could inform the gender-related motive understandings of the crimes if we actually mobilized as a group. So I'll leave it at that, and thank you very much.